morning, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. And today we will be covering Chapter 10 of The Wealth of Nations, of wages and profit in the different employments of labor and stock. So, in this chapter, Smith examines exactly how wages and profit differ in different industries and why they differ. So let's begin. The advantages and disadvantages of stock and employment must be equal in the same neighborhood. Otherwise, so many would crowd into the advantageous one and flee the disadvantageous, they would return to the mean quickly. At least Smith believed this would be the case in a perfectly free society, where men could pick and choose their endeavors at liberty. All would seek an advantage while shunning the disadvantaged. So, Smith is just saying here that if we lived in a truly liberated culture where everyone had absolute opportunity, then people would flock to the best opportunities and go away from the worst ones. Nobody would work fast food if everybody could be paid like a doctor. Actual money, wages, and profit differ dramatically throughout the world, and they vary in accordance with the area of trade or expertise. These differences can be brought down to the variations in the employments themselves and the policies imposed by the countries in question. Part 1 of Chapter 10 delves into the inequalities derived from the nature of employment. Smith divides their nature into 5 parts: how agreeable is the work, how difficult it is, how constant the trade is, how much trust is placed in those who work the field, and finally, how probable success is in a particular venture. When work is harder, people will generally be paid more to do it. For that reason, a tailor made less than a weaver who made less than a smith when this book was written. However, Adam Smith thought honor and cleanliness also influenced the wages due to a trade. The disgraced and the unclean would earn more money as a recompense for their suffering in his eyes. This is why a butcher earned as much as he did. Butchers were paid very well, but they dealt with very unclean and unpleasant things. Public executioners were seen as having the most detestable career of all, yet they had far higher wages than any common trade. Hunting and fishing, on the other hand, were once a necessity to sustain life, but as society advanced, they were relegated to becoming a pastime for most. Those who continued to hunt and fish for a living tend to be among the most poor in advanced nations. Since people are drawn to these for pleasure, wages are pushed down. Although, in today's world, cold water fishermen can still earn a killing in the frigid northern waters, catching salmon and tuna. But in Smith's time, that was not the case. If you were making a living by fishing, then you were probably pretty poor. Similarly, disgrace and disagreeableness were thought to affect the profits of stock in like manner. Smith talks of an innkeeper, one who never has domain over his own property and is exposed to the violence of drunkards on a nightly basis, and how they gain massive profits for a tiny investment. The ease of entering a trade or the difficulty or expense of learning a business also impacts how much people earn. When an industrialist spends a great deal to install a new machine, they expect to gain more from it during its useful lifetime than they invested. That's the return on investment. Men who invest much into their education likewise anticipate comparable earnings once they have finished their schooling. The work they perform and what they earn above typical labor should compensate them for the time and money spent on training. This is the foundation of the difference between skilled and unskilled labor costs. Back in this era, European custom and policies imposed apprenticeships on all who wished to become skilled laborers, and the way this was practiced functioned as a huge burden to all apprentices. Most of them would have to be supported by family during their time with the master, and often they would have to pay the master in money and time for his service. These were not paid internships. They actually paid the company for the opportunity to be in an internship, basically. Common laborers, in comparison, could work immediately, and they would be self-supporting throughout their entire careers. As a result, the mechanics and artisans of Europe received higher wages and thought themselves to be of a superior class. However, Smith was careful to note their superiority was small in reality. Skilled work was more regular and consistent, but what their extra payment only compensated them for the cost of education. But the amount that they got paid extra really just covered the cost and lost time of when they were invested. They didn't actually earn that much more than common laborers whenever you took that into account. The use of stock to generate income does not appear to be as affected by the difficulty or easiness of a trade. Using your stock to make a profit was equally as easy in every branch. Labor wages also vary with the consistency of employment. Certain professions have much more job security, such as those involved with manufacturing. They are nearly guaranteed work every day of the year. Masons and bricklayers, on the other hand, are confined to days with suitable weather and the demand of their customers. Therefore, what they earn must be sufficient to maintain them through periods of idleness, when work slows down, and it should be enough to soothe any anxiety these situations arise. Smith tells us that these employments were often paid 50 to 100% more than common labor, but these elevated payments were truly compensation for the inconsistency of their fields. And it's the same case for all types of seasonal labor. Erratic, hard, and dirty work can sometimes elevate the wages of common labor above those of skilled artisans. For example, London coal workers could earn 4 or 5 times more than a typical city worker, due to the irregular and difficult nature of their jobs. Still, their wages are limited by the same forces governing all wages. If employers paid too much, the number of those willing to work the mines would increase until wages fell again. Trust regulates wages as well. For example, goldsmiths and jewelers were paid more than regular workers, due to the precious materials they handle. Doctors and lawyers benefit from this too. Since we trust them with our lives and health, they command superior wages than most. This is not the case regarding the profits of stock. If you use your own stock, trust does not enter the equation, and if others give you the stock, they value your enterprise according to other factors. The final influence on the cost of wages is the likelihood of success. In a given profession, some number of possible participants are bound to fail, and the wages they would have earned will go to those who are successful. Some fields nearly guarantee success, like the mechanical trades, although others are much more uncertain. Liberal arts careers, like that of the law, will have 20 fail to the one who succeeds, and that one who succeeds will gain all the others have lost. Professions like these attract people due to the earnings and the status associated with them, but the payoff is less than perceived. Many lawyers do not truly start to make money until they are near 40 years old and have invested massive amounts into their education. Smith believed the compensation of some professions consists almost entirely in the public's admiration and not actual money payments. In The Wealth of Nations, he compares like poets and philosophers to this. They didn't actually earn a whole lot, just like most of them don't make much today, but they were held in high regard. Disreputable professions must compensate workers enough to offset the unsavory effects of the career on their character. Smith's example is that of an opera singer, which I kind of thought was strange. One who possesses great talent, but according to Smith's writing, was viewed down upon by society at large. Another factor that pushes and pulls on wages is how much men believe in their good fortunes. The majority of people underestimate the odds of loss when evaluating a profession and overestimate the likelihood of gain, especially when they are in good spirits. We still call this today the gambler's fallacy. Lotteries operate based on this principle. Almost everyone who purchases a ticket will lose what they spent, but the chance at gaining a fortune is enough to sway opinion. People always buy lottery tickets. Insurance illustrates the opposite. The entire industry earns modest profits based on men's unwillingness to consider losses as probable. Premiums must be sold at a level that is sufficient to compensate for the typical losses borne by a market, and the wages for management and a profit for the owners on top of that. Smith comments on how few people at the time would carry policies for their home. It was more common for merchants to insure their vessels, but still many would forego the cost. He believed that this innate tendency to overvalue success and undervalue failure was at its peak in youth, when people were usually picking their first profession. We can also see this principle in action if we look at how willing people are to sign up for the military rather than pursue a more liberal calling. Young volunteers will pour into the ranks at the beginning of war. Filled with hopes of honor and distinguishment, they disregard the possibility of death. Common laborers out-earn them and they work in easier conditions. So, soldiers work almost entirely for their unlikely hopes. At least, this is what Smith assumed. Profits fluctuate along with the price of commodities. When commodities increase in cost, profits follow, and they fall whenever costs lower. All commodities are susceptible to these changes, but some are more volatile than others. Certain industries always produce the same amount, and their prices are likely to remain stagnant. Overproduction or underproduction can both push prices above or below standard rates. Think of oil. Sometimes oil prices go up, sometimes oil prices go down, and a lot of that depends on how much oil is being produced by the oil companies. This parity in wages can only occur in spaces where trades occupy most of people's time, however. If their occupation leaves them with plenty of spare time, people often experiment with other income-producing activities, even if these pay less than their primary trade. Ancient farms would be run by one master who employed serfs and paid them a pittance while also providing for their housing and food. Smith said that this housing and food actually comprised a large portion of their overall, what we would call a compensation package today. So the actual money value of what they got may not have been a ton compared to other people back then, but they did have room and board covered for. And whenever the master had no need for their labor, the serfs would hawk their services to others for far less than a typical laborer would. Today a modern worker may earn $30 an hour at their day job. That's like $60K a year. And then they may go and work a side gig like, DoorDash that pays them like almost half of what their usual rate is in their off time. Smith says that advanced economies usually have sufficient market potential so that workers can be satisfied with only one trade. He tells us that people occupying multiple trades is usually a symptom of a poor nation. Now, part 2 of chapter 10 concerns the inequalities occasioned by European policy, although this can be extended to, any kind of governmental policy. But he was a man of his time. So, Smith tells us the equality in wages can only occur in places where there is a perfect liberty and where market forces are uncontained or unrestricted. Government policies can restrict competition in a specific sector, lowering the number of market occupants below what it would be otherwise. In some instances, policies actually increase competition, and in both of these cases, policy choices create market distortions. Also, some policies can limit how easily people can switch between one employment and another, or even make it difficult for them to move locations. Think about, nowadays doctors, they get licensed in a particular state, and if they want to move to a new state, they have to go through the licensing process all over again, so it makes it much more difficult for them to move around. According to Smith, the exclusive privileges of corporations are the principal means by which they execute these purposes. Incorporated trades may stipulate new entrants must apprentice with a particular master, and they may restrict how many can apprentice at one time. When the Wealth of Nations was written, these bylaws could even force people to work in one trade for a predetermined number of years after their apprenticeship. For example, in Norfolk, master weavers with more than 2 apprentices had to pay £5 a month to the king, so they usually only got 2 at a time. And since antiquity, 7 years was the usual length of any apprenticeship, though this could vary. Smith wrote that ancient incorporations were called universities, and said that university is the proper Latin term for any incorporation whatsoever. That is new to me. By the 5th of Elizabeth, Parliament had enacted laws limiting people from serving in any trade unless they had apprenticed under a master for 7 years. This transformed the bylaws of corporations into public law throughout the kingdom. In reality, these laws were only enforced in large market cities, and country villages would often have people occupying multiple trades without the requisite training. Smith was not a fan of these laws. And he wrote that the true property of all men is the labor of their hands, and this is the foundation of all property. So it must be sacred and inviolable. Hindering a poor man from utilizing the strength and dexterity of his hands would then be a violation of his most sacred rights. He believed it to be an encroachment on the liberty of both the worker and potential employers, and he said judgment on who is appropriate to serve a given occupation should be left to the employer and out of the hands of the lawgiver. Be like, letting a hospital decide who's qualified to be a doctor, and not the university system. There is, to serve as a doctor, you do have to get licensed, and that's all regulated by the state. I'm not sure if I agree with Smith on that one. Long apprenticeships do not even guarantee the public will not suffer from inadequate work, as the majority of inadequate work is fraudulent. Instituting these extensive training programs does not safeguard people against fraudsters, so we must rely on a different set of regulations for protection. When you add a sterling mark or a specific identifier of equality to an item, the purchaser has much more security than any given by an apprenticeship. Think of like the emblem that's given that's put on a car that signifies it's a Mercedes or a BMW. There's a guarantee of its quality. We know those brands because they are well made. Buyers will examine these emblems or markers despite never inquiring about the workman's training. Also, these long apprenticeships hold back the young from being as productive as possible. Journeymen will be very industrious because they derive a profit from their production. However, the idle apprentice lacks motivation since his immediate interests are not served by exertion. In entry-level jobs, the entire benefit of labor is the payment, and the people employed in these pursuits are more likely to develop a taste for industry. That's why we see people working so much overtime. Young people are averse to labor when there is no immediate benefit. Apprenticeships were not a part of ancient culture. Roman law does not speak of them at all, and there is not a proper word to express the idea in Greek or Latin. At least, in this context, he's talking about serving under a master for a predetermined number of years in exchange for learning how to do a trade. And Smith says that these extended training programs are unnecessary and claims that the arts are superior to other trades for this reason. He believed that once something was invented and well understood, like clockmaking, all people needed was the knowledge of how to apply them. You didn't necessarily need more than a few weeks in his eyes to learn how to do this, even if it took a long time to develop this stuff in the first place. And he thought that young men would be more diligent if they benefited from their work as a journeyman would right from the beginning. Education costs would lower, although the master of a trade would lose as a result. The masters would no longer receive the proceeds from their apprentices, and the apprentice may even become a loser as well. Since there would be less of a barrier to entry, more competitors would appear, and everyone's earnings could drop because of the rise in competition. However, if you believe what Smith says, there should be a corresponding drop in the price of goods as well, so maybe it would all even out. Corporations and corporate law has been developed specifically to prevent the reduction of price, wages, and profits by restraining free competition. Ancient corporations did not depend on the state like they do today, but rather they could form with the sole blessing of the town where they were formed. England differed, and people had to request a charter from the king. But Smith says these were mostly a way for the crown to extort money from enterprise instead of protecting the public from monopolies. Once the charter was paid, the king would readily grant them. When artisans operated as a corporation, they would not be disbanded, but instead they would be hit with a fine. And as long as they paid these, they could continue to operate. Town governments were already in the hand of these tradesmen and artisans, so it was in their interest to prevent overproduction in their market. Thus, they were eager to establish regulations that controlled the market and propped up prices. Although they had to buy things at a higher price, they could also sell them at a markup. When they sold to other countries, they gained much, because these other countries may not have been as regulated as they were. Every town depends on the countryside, and it pays for the material of industry in two ways. One, they send back some materials to the country with the added cost of wages and profit. Two, they send it further away to places abroad or inland, and they also tacked on the additional cost of wages and profit in these cases. Wages and profit comprise the gain of both, and regulations aim to increase these. The overall goal is to enable the town to purchase more with less. Landlords and farmers tend to be the losers in this equation, and towns gain at the expense of the countryside. The pricier towns' products are, and the less they pay for country materials, the more advantage is given to the industry of the town. Smith shows us an easy way to see this advantage in action. For every one person who has amassed a fortune in the countryside, there are at least 10 times as many who have become wealthy in the city. Because of this, people flee from rural areas and flock to the cities. This is a trend we still see playing out to this day. Townspeople can combine their forces more easily, and this allows smaller trades to incorporate. These combinations can restrict how many can work in a particular industry and increase the cost of what they produce. In the countryside, on the contrary, people are further apart and unable to combine with such ease. Corporations are much rarer, and the spirit of incorporation does not prevail among them. Husbandry does not require an apprenticeship, for example, despite the abundance of knowledge required to be effective in this pursuit. Many of the branches of inferior country labor, as Smith called it, or perhaps what we might call blue-collar work today, require more skill and experience than the supposed advanced trades. Farmers must work with a variety of tools and understand how they operate, along with the condition of his instruments. Sure, they may be less sociable than someone who works in the city, but their work still requires great knowledge. However, the superior state of town-based industry is not solely due to corporations and their laws. They also benefit from government regulations. Taxes are levied on foreign imports to support domestic production and prevent outsiders from undercutting prices. These function similarly to the corporate laws and how they elevate local wages by reducing or increasing competition where they otherwise would differ. Price elevations are paid by landlords in the end, renters, farmers, and laborers who live outside of the city. It did specify that towns' superiority had declined in recent memory. Country wages had risen, and the disparity had lessened between the two. He thought this was the result of town industry's advantage, and that after a time stock accumulates to a point where it is unable to be fully utilized there. Lower profits in town force investors to look outside toward the country for expansion. This strategy then raises demand for country labor and elevates wages. Everywhere in Europe, there had been an overflowing of stock to the country, and it benefited the whole of society, or at least that was the idea. He delves deeper into this topic during the third and fourth books of The Wealth of Nations. Smith also thought that when people from the same trade gathered together, it would invariably end in a conspiracy to increase prices, something that is against the public's interest. Meetings like this are impossible to outlaw without infringing on liberty and justice, yet no laws should be enacted to facilitate these assemblies, from Smith's point of view. Requiring everyone to register their businesses in a public registry connects individuals who may never have known of each other and facilitates these types of meetings. If there is a regulation that forces same industry corporations to subject themselves to a tax in order to support their poor and sick, that makes these meetings necessary. Incorporating goes further and converts the act of the majority into a binding agreement on the whole. When you are in a true free trade environment, the only way to establish a combination is by uniting everyone in the assembly into a unanimous consent, and they dissolve as soon as the members begin to disagree. A corporate majority can write bylaws and render due penalties far more effectively than any freely established combination. Smith wrote that corporations were not necessary for the betterment of trade governance. He felt that the establishment of a corporation prevented the natural discipline of workers. Since the corporation always needs workers, people lose their fear of the customer, which should be what governs their action. Only the fear of unemployment motivates them, and that is why some cities experience such a shortage of well-behaved workers. European policy encourages competition in some occupations beyond what is natural, and this creates another kind of inequality. Smith talks about how certain trades are seen as necessary for the public, and because of this necessity, private individuals, governments, and corporations sponsor scholarships and pensions. These devices bring more people into the trade than otherwise would be possible. And when the Wealth of Nations was published, this is how the majority of the church was funded. Those who educated themselves in this way were willing to accept lower wages than their extensive training should have brought them. One could think of a chaplain as being paid as much as a journeyman in any other trade. Since they had a free education, their lesser wages equaled those of the higher paying trades in reality. Parliament actually regulated the pay of curates who serve in the church and forced them to be paid higher. This was contrary to the usual action of the government, who often sought to regulate wages lower. Its conception was that other practices, such as law and medicine, would suffer from the same effects if their education was subsidized by the public. More people would enter the trade and competition would rise, enough to lower wages and profits. Then it might stop being worthwhile for those interested in pursuing it, and soon only those willing to work for meager wages would fill the ranks. This would demolish the respectability of these professions. The men of letters had already succumbed to this fate in Smith's time. They were all educated at public expense by the church, but were prevented from entering the holy orders for one reason or another. As a result, these men would accept paltry payments for their services. Before the invention of printing, men of letters would serve as public or private teachers, but now they mostly wrote for booksellers. Even in this era, teachers were seen as being paid less than their worth, and they were recognized as having similar training to great physicians and lawyers. So underpayment of teachers is not a new thing. This led to more people, Smith saw the only difference between these trades was how educators were spared the expense of education, unlike practitioners of law and medicine. This led to more people entering education, increasing competition. Apparently, scholars and beggars were seen as synonymous, and many universities gave their scholars a license to beg, so maybe teachers are paid a little better today. However, ancient societies paid their teachers even better, as there were no public subsidies for their trade. Isocrates lauded the sophists, who were ancient Greek teachers that taught rhetoric, and Plato, satirized them a lot in his dialogues. But the sophists who accepted only 4 or 5 minae for their teachings, while Isocrates demanded at least 10 from each student. Plutarch also told us that his usual price for teaching was 1,000 minae, and other contemporaries likewise amassed great fortunes from teaching. In Plato's dialogues, teachers like Gregorius and Protagoras were seen as living an ostentatious lifestyle, and Plato himself was said to have lived a magnificent life. Aristotle was richly rewarded by King Philip of Macedon for tutoring Alexander the Great, and in these long-past times, eminent teachers were a rarity. As ages passed, teachers filled the ranks of society, and their wages decreased in turn. Nevertheless, Smith saw this degradation of the institution to be a net benefit to society. Even though the public stature of a teacher had been diminished, the cheapness of literary education obviously added a great advantage to the social order. European policy also obstructs the free movement of labor and stock, limiting transitions from employment to employment and from place to place. Apprenticeships would stipulate that people were bound to the same occupation, and it would stop them from plying their trade elsewhere. This would be like if you went to college for psychology, you would legally be obligated to only work in that field. So, everybody who has a psychology degree working elsewhere, you would not have had as much luck back in Smith's time. Smith noticed how some manufacturers would pay their workers abundantly in one location while giving far less to workers in another city. Absurd laws limited the transfer of workers from one industry to another, even when the industries were very much alike. Smith gave us the example of weaving silks and linen. Although these trades are nearly identical, the statutes of apprenticeship would prohibit workers from changing between the two. In consequence, this imposed a limitation on the free circulation of stock as well. The quantity of stock that can be deployed in an industry depends on the number of people able to work in it. Corporate laws seem to regulate labor more than it does capital, and it is always easier for a merchant to gain the privilege of trading in a town than it is for an artisan to be licensed to work there. But if there are not enough artisans to work in an industry, you won't have anywhere to use your stock. Smith spoke of how European labor policy had degraded to its present condition, tracing it back to medieval laws regulating charity. Long ago, monasteries were destroyed, and this led to masses of the poor losing their sustenance. Queen Elizabeth declared that every parish, kind of like a county, except with some religious affiliation, should be required to provide for its own poor in response. Parishes then had to decide who were the poor and how to care for them, a topic of great importance, considering it was now legalized, a legal obligation to care for the homeless, basically. No such obligation exists today. Deciding who qualified for assistance thus became a topic of paramount importance. Charles II codified this statute by saying that any person who lived in a parish for 40 days should be considered a resident. However, a justice of the peace, in fact 2 of them, could send them back to their previous legal parish unless they had secured a tenement of at least £10 a year, which was far more than most people in this situation could afford. Some parishes responded fraudulently and would pay the poor to resettle and remain hidden for 40 days to become members of another parish. James II attempted to rectify this problem by establishing a rule where the 40 days only started after a new settler had delivered notice to the new parish. Yet some parishes would not take account of these letters, so the proper countdown never started. William III specified that such notices should be given at Sunday church service. That way the public could keep record. The establishment of these laws meant poor people could not relocate in the old ways. By announcing their move, they gave the parish a reason to evict them from the province. For most people, the only way for them to move was by service. They could pay taxes at the local parish rate to become a resident or serve as an apprentice. However, almost all apprentices were unmarried. Most could not afford to establish residence by renting a tenement if they had to depend on their labor alone. Remember, apprentices were not always paid in money. They were given housing and stuff like food for their payment, at least until they were able to be journeymen. And this all made it extremely difficult for people to move around the country. To restore the free movement of labor, William III created a rule obligating any parish to receive a newcomer who had presented a certificate from their previous parish, which had been signed by 2 justices of the peace. If the man became dependent on charity, it was the responsibility of their last parish to provide for them. Now, the great disparity in English wages at the time was largely due to these restrictive laws, according to Smith. Since it was so difficult to move from one place to the next, a shortage of hands could not easily be remedied by a superabundance of hands nearby. It'd be like if you had a coal mine and there were not enough workers and there was a whole bunch of unemployed in the town over, but you legally could not hire them because they lived somewhere else. Obviously, we can see where problems might arise. Smith saw how places without these restrictions, like Scotland, did not suffer from these massive discrepancies. Removing a man from where he wishes to belong is a manifest violation of his liberty. Yet the poor of England suffered under these laws without protest for centuries. They lived like that for 400 years. Parliament still tried enacting laws to regulate wages in some cases, like how George III limited the amount weavers could charge for their services in a day. Laws that were governed by the workers tended to be just and equitable, while those written by the masters were not always so. Even ancient cultures tried to limit the profit of merchants by regulating what they could charge for their goods. However, natural competition would produce better results than any law. Thus, the ratio between wages and profits seems unaffected by the wealth or poverty of society. They seem to remain the same unless there is a general revolution in the welfare of society. And that ends Chapter 10, one of the longer ones we've touched so far. This is a wandering author signing off here and asking you guys, what are y'all doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your local community today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part, and you can count on me to do mine daily. Until next time, God bless.